So this is my commentary on chapter 25 of the Proverbs. I'm going to be beginning here with verse 1. Now today happens to be a Saturday. An overall lazy Saturday. Somewhat productive, mostly not. But now it's time to put forth some effort to be productive, to think about some of these verses, to think about different concepts, illustrations for which we can expand our understanding, our knowledge. The first verse, these are also prophets of Solomon, which the men of Hezekiah, king of Judah, copied out. Now there's an interesting history here. King Solomon, from what I understand, ruled about 900 BC, 900 something BC. He was the son of King David, one of the righteous kings of Israel. And what we are seeing here in this first verse is that this is interestingly referenced in a period that's about 200 years after this was likely to have been written by King Solomon in his established order. Hezekiah was the 13th king of Judah. His reign, from what I see here on the internet, was roughly 715 to 686 BCE. Now this is a reign that is 200 years after the reign of King Solomon. Much like King Solomon, Hezekiah was a righteous king of Judah. He was a person that got rid of the idol worship, reestablished the temple in Jerusalem. He was a contemporary of the prophet Isaiah. At this time, the big geopolitical concern was the encroaching Assyrian Empire. He was involved with the revealing of his treasury to the political representatives, perhaps I could say, of Babylon. And this led Isaiah to predict that this sort of situation, this event, would lead to the downfall of Judah, and in a broader sense, the subjection of the Jews to the Babylonians. So the second verse reads, "It is the glory of God to conceal a thing, but the honor of kings is to search out a matter." So like always, I'm going to start with the first half of the verse and work my way through it. But there has been something on my mind recently that I would like to integrate into this reflection, if at all possible. Now, I'm not sure if it's going to come up, but it may. Now, the interesting part about the Proverbs, I've conceptualized these verses as akin to a key that opens a door. Now, what door it opens can vary, but invariably, the space that we enter into is something of a vast environment that we can explore, that we can build, that we can be guided. Sometimes there are verses that are quite direct, but even in their directness, there is room for us to explore. There is room for us to question, to doubt, and to have good reason to believe in what is being said. And so it covers the whole range, and I think that before going into this, I would just like to say that we should not be afraid to explore every aspect, because what we are after is the firmness of being a strong constitution, a solid spirit, unwavering spirit. It is the glory of God to conceal a thing. So why would it be the glory of God to conceal something? So in order to understand this, we have to understand what it means, what glory means, and then what it means to conceal something. Now, I'm often quite nitpicky about words, because at this level it matters quite a bit what they mean and what they imply. Now, there are a few other things I think that could be said here that are of interest to my mind. One is that whenever we see God, I think what should be roused in us is a degree of skepticism, but not a skepticism that leads us away from goodness. Now, when I say that, I primarily say it because in the modern day, we're so used to giving ourselves supporting evidence for our claims. But this type of experience, this type of experimentation, is top-down. We're trying to form an integrated sense within mind. And although perhaps experimentation may help us, there's probably plenty of things that caused King Solomon to say such a thing. And it is possible, perhaps, that he may have erred in his saying. But if there is anything within this statement that is true, and I could just as easily say it the other way, it is probable, given one of the wise kings of ancient Israel, that he understood quite well the workings of a wise person and of the broad patterns of the divine insight. And so he would probably be a good person to trust when we are considering such a verse. After all, we are to consider that the Bible is the Word of God, or at least divinely inspired. Secondly, my mind goes to the event that I had mentioned. Now, today it happens to be a Sunday. Sunday, usually I go out for dinner with a group of friends. And it just so happened that today was uncharacteristic of many Sundays past. It was uncharacteristic in the sense that there was an argument or a fight. And it was quite personal. It was quite intimate. And it caught me and everyone else that was at the table by surprise. Now, I say this to say that the cause of this argument had been building slowly over a period of time. And the unfortunate thing was the presentation. The beginning of the argument began with heated passions and uncontrolled, poor contextualization, which gave to reciprocation of the same by the offended party. And I mention this because even within the passions, even within the reciprocation of the offended party, there were elements, there were things that were true. There were things I think that needed to be said. But the way in which they were said cut like a knife, rather than built like a mason would stack his bricks to build a house. And I have to wonder about this matter of perspective. That there are many ways that we can see, whether it be an object or an argument, a verse, It'll never be the case, most likely, that we can see the totality of it. Just as I hold up this quarter in my hand, there's at no point a place that I can put this object that I can see every surface continuously. Now, perhaps there's some way I could increase my perceptive capacity by using mirrors, but for the most part, generally speaking, I am unable to see all aspects of it. Now, that's not the end of the world, but it is the end of the world if the passions only allow us to see a particular perspective and then don't allow us, through the grace of patience, to examine all parts so that we understand the whole. And so with that in mind, with that spirit in mind, I would like to approach this verse. Now, it is with a bit of irony, I think, that what we are discussing here is concealing something. And as I just mentioned, what we're attempting to do is to examine the aspects so that we are free from this concealment. When we are free of this concealment, or what's underneath, then we can see more, we can see something greater. We come to a conclusion, a perspective, for which we had not understood before. Now, the first question that comes to mind here is, why would it be the case that God would conceal something? And why would it be His glory to do so? And it seems as though that's possible. Although I'm open to examining something in a broader sense, but it seems as though we are talking about specifically in the human context. But as I consider it, think about it, it seems as though this can apply to any agent that is beneath the centerpiece of intelligibility, the origin of intelligibility. That what lies underneath can only see any given part at any given time, or may be restricted to a certain level of experience, a certain level of consciousness. Again, the question is, why the willful concealment? Why hide anything from the agents that are born beneath? Now, first I would like to think about this word glory. There are a few different ways I think that we can conceptualize it. There's one that seems to me to make the most sense. Of glory, magnificence and splendor comes to mind. The awe-inspiring power or capacity to do this, to conceal something. We could think of honor, we can think of renown, we could think of praise and worship. Now, this can be quite likely because we are seeing this experience in the world from the human perspective. We're not saying that we are seeing as God sees, but we are seeing as man sees, God's intervention in man's experience. So it's an interesting expression, because certainly glory is something that we can see. We can see magnificence, and we can see beauty. These sorts of things, I think, lead us to praise and worship. And so that brings me to consider then, much like the argument with my friends, as I was sitting in the very uncomfortable environment of the back and forth, I saw what was underneath. I saw the issue at hand. Of course, it wasn't my place to butt in, although maybe I could have took a certain road to enter into that conversation productively, but it's hard to say in hindsight. But nonetheless, despite the uncomfortability, there was glory there. There was goodness there. but it was concealed beneath the passions. And I see this in this verse. It is the glory of God to conceal a thing. But then, of course, the question is, well, is this actually what the verse is referring to? Because in this situation, particularly in the situation of the two parties that were arguing back and forth, that were blinded by their passions, it was their own failure to see that allowed them to breach through that hard tack of emotion and to move to the underneath. But all the same, in my situation, in my seat, I did see that which was concealed to them. And so here's a matter of perspective. I think that brings me to my first crossroad. In the first instance, I think there are plenty of layers that I can go through. There are plenty of things that I can identify that are concealed. There are plenty of things that were revealed in the argument. But all the same, I still want to differentiate man's blindness from the glory of God being concealed. And perhaps it's not necessarily something that is separate. Perhaps what is being implied here is that because of man's experience, because of his limited capacity to take in information and to identify patterns and to see mindedness in his physical interface, that perhaps it is possible that this concealment may be a part of our blindness, but when it is seen, when it is uncovered, then what we are seeing is the glory of God. Now this is contrasted to the potential interpretation that God is willfully concealing something from man for some purpose. Now the question is, well, what is that purpose? So there are these two, I think, potential interpretations. Now, of the former, I am particularly fond of, especially in light of the situation that I had today. Again, this is a situation in which man is limited by his experience, by the level of his interface. But when he finds that which is underneath the hood, the truth of the matter, then what is revealed to him is the glory. Now, on the other hand, this word conceal, I think, implies intention to keep from sight, to hide something. Now, I think there are plenty of reasons that one should hide, that one can hide something. Whether or not they should, I suppose, is a different matter. But of this matter, of the should and should not, I think there are both conditions. Now, we believe that there is a God that is good. And so there is what we think about, what we explore, is the potential for God hiding something that ought to be hidden or concealed from man. And then the question is, well, why? And here, I think, comes into play perception. I think to hide something or to keep something away from somebody may not imply in totality. I think it doesn't imply totality. The second part of the verse implies that it doesn't. I think the reason that something may be kept from somebody is that if somebody were to have what has been drawn away from them, that they may use whatever it is for poor purposes. It may be beyond their understanding. Now the question is raised, well, what is the potential for this type of concealment? My mind immediately went to the atomic bomb. And the question is, well, if this was given to another civilization at another age, would they have been ready to accept the responsibility? Follow-up question, are we able to accept that responsibility? Is this something that should have been concealed longer than it had? Was it by the failure of man that he brought it to bear against God's wishes? Now, this is hard to really make any heads or tails of. Another question, a more immediate question, again with the staying on the topic of the argument that happened today at dinner. Of the two parties in concern, taking me out of it, if they are unable to see what was concealed, at least immediately, is it the case that it had to have been concealed in order to just get the information out, even if it was attached to all the passions and the conversation had left a massive cliffhanger and there was no resolution to it, and perhaps it created a rift that was deeper than it ought to have? I may be out of line or out of interpretation when I go here, but what is created now can be seen as something that is quite negative, but it can also be seen as something that is fruitful for the future, potentially, that this can be something that can be readdressed. Now, there's no way in which these two people can be in a disunion. They're part of the same family. I suppose in the extreme case they can be, but this argument, it doesn't seem like it would be the end. But it certainly it rocked the boat. And because of what we have now in front of us, I think it is up to us, it is our will, that we have been presented something that was concealed. At least they have been presented something that was concealed. But it is up to them. It is in the case of the modern man in the 21st century, it is the honor of the individual to search out the matter. Now, the glory of God is there, but it is up to man to decide the matter. It is up to his will. Now, the second part of this verse, but the honor of kings is to search out the matter. I think we can probably modify this a little bit, like I said, and add individual where the kings are. Because the individual, at least in the political milieu of the United States, the traditional milieu of the United States, the individual holds this position, this kingly type position. He is the authority of his house. He is the ruler over his efforts. And of course, he participates in something larger. This thing that is larger is not unitary like a king. It is something that he participates in. Now, whether it be good or whether it be bad, the agent that he participates with is almost beyond man. It is a representation of the collective. It's a different type of agent, rather than the singular, like a king or a small group of bureaucrats that support the king, or a larger aristocratic governing structure in which the king would have some power and the nobility would have a certain degree of autonomy. but it's still highly centralized. And there are various ways, I think, that we can see this centralization and decentralization, even within democratic societies. Now, that aside, the matter of the king and his position aside, the main thing is here, regardless of the position of man, whether it be the sovereignty of the king in this situation or the sovereignty of the individual, it is the honor of him to search out that which is concealed. And here I think about what is necessary to seek out that which is concealed, almost like a game of hide and seek. We are purposefully looking for something that we know is there, but is hidden from our view. We are looking for that good which is hidden. Now, on the contrary side, we can consider the situation in which man does not choose to accept that goodness. He does not choose to find the glory of God. And he chooses to see the rift, the hell that's beneath, the fire that has come from it, the pain that has been caused by the opening of the wound. And that can be the thing that is driving. That can be the thing that decides whether or not man can see the glory of God. Now, this is not something that I think would be of God's doing, although it exists underneath the umbrella of his world, of his landscape. It is something that the agents run into because of their lack of sight. That because of the lack of sight of man and the acceptance of various agents to do as they will, given that they have some degree of autonomy, and that the structure of this reality that we find ourselves in. And I would like to reiterate again the capacity of a minded agent having qualities in reflection of that divine source, that divine creative insight, the divine mind, that it has this capacity, possibility to produce and to put out there the creative element, the generative element, and also to exist towards nothingness in the sense of evil, that it is by the creation of something, perhaps even the idea of nothing, that it is possible to put forth the consideration that just as much as God can conceal something from us for good, he can also do it for wicked or evil purposes. It requires of us a particular type of faith to say that our God is good, and our mind is in the image of this God. We have a broad capacity to create, a broad capacity to take away and to destroy. And it is for our better angels, for the goodness of our being and of our existence, that we accept the concealment, the hiding of information from man, such that he is put on the path to seek it. Now, if he comes to an unfortunate road, then it is, in a rough sense, a part of life. It's not any rougher than the Darwinian natural selection bit, but in this situation, instead of a totalitarian giving us direction and limiting our mind to the bureaucracy of the heavens, what we are given is a blank slate. It is the free man of the democratic institution. He is the participant now in the mind that created him. He is, in some sense, not the mind that created him, but now a participant, an aspect, a perspective of the whole. And the whole has an agency of its own, an agency that is responsible for the overall motion, much like we are responsible for the overall motion of the cells in our body, but we, as conscious agents, don't necessarily control what the cells do. I am quite thankful that the cells are running my organs at this moment. The interesting thing is, when they decide to stop, for whatever reason, then my agency will cease to exist. It's a fascinating existence that we find ourselves in. But with regard to the verse, the last thing that I would say is that this word honor, I think, is worth some consideration. Because, again, whether it is the king or the individual, wherever the sovereignty happens to be, the honor is a type of privilege, it is a type of way of seeing the concealment. It is the commitment to the faith that there is something underneath a problem that is yet to be solved because of the glory of God. And it is up to us to seek out that glory, to peek around the corner to find our friend hiding in that hiding place. It's up to us to put forth the initiative, to make the effort, to commit. The heaven for height and the earth for depth, and the heart of kings is unsearchable. So this verse is not immediately clear to me what it means. When I see the heaven for height, what I think about is the orientation of attention. That when we turn our eyes towards heaven, that is towards, in some sense, a place of mind, in some sense not necessarily separate from our level or layer of interface, and by extension I don't think it's necessarily separate from matter, even though there are many classification systems that do separate the two. I think that when we see heaven, what we are looking at is in a way beyond the material world, but also there are elements of the material world that that put us in a position to be able to perceive it. And although we may not necessarily be able to see it as we break down matter, as we break apart bits into smaller and smaller pieces, it is by virtue of the constitution of matter that is arranged such that we can exist, that we can operate on this plane, on this level, that the mind then is able to reach up and see something that is beyond that of his typical experience. Now, that sort of reasoning is never a satisfying thing, surely. But of this height, I think there is an important conversation, there's an important reflection. And it appears to be obvious that this verse is referring to this vertical structure, the heaven for height, and then as we go up that positive y-axis, we go more into the heavens, and then down into the negative y-axis, we have this earthly realm. But the important question is, well, what is the word height? What is it referencing? And then subsequently, what is the word depth? What is it referencing there? Now, of the heavenly domain, I think what I imagine is that this is a place of mind, that this is a place of intelligence. This is a place that various agents exist as a part of, or in communion with, a broader awareness. This broader awareness is the purposeful element or purposeful component. It is the final cause, I suppose, in Aristotle's four causes. We, as agents, represent the efficient cause, or that agent mover type of category, in which we participate in the final cause. We participate in the purpose. We participate in the various ends by bringing things into being. But of course we are not God. We are not the thing that is responsible for being itself. We are just using the currency of intelligibility and of materiality, which is another one of his formal causes, the material causes. And in order to translate between the material and the agentic, we move through the form, we move through the essence, the blueprint. And so, when I think about this in the Aristotelian sense, it gives me at least a background, a place to start when I think about the depth going into the earth. Because the heavenly is more of the formal, it is more of the final, it is the purposeful end that becomes increasingly unitary at the top, singular in its cause, its purpose. And as we branch down into the agentic arena, I think here we find that we are within heaven, but underneath its roof, where its roof is this a triangular structure that comes together as a point, almost like a pyramid, I think, in my mind, at the top of which is that divine I, that divine logos, the peak of intelligibility, or the origin of intelligibility. Underneath, in that agentic arena, in the arena of becomings and of manipulation of meaning, of desires and of ends, the agents are allowed to exist on that plane. Now, that plane in and of itself, I think, can be multivariate, as in our situation. The human being exists in the agentic arena, but perhaps he doesn't occupy the final cause. He participates in it, but he is not the final cause. And as we move down away from that, beneath the roof of heaven and that divine peak, into the chamber of heaven itself, and then down underneath it, as we enter into the earth, we move into the blueprint, essence, form, and then down into that material realm, for which that basic substrate forms the needed, I want to say material, but the needed information to make more sophisticated, and it doesn't necessarily have to be more sophisticated, but more purposeful, I should say, more purposeful designs out of that which is less purposeful. And the earth for depth, and the heart of kings is unsearchable. So the heaven for height, and the earth for depth, and the heart of kings is unsearchable. So what in the world does this mean? We have just talked about heaven and the earth. In some sense, we've discussed a degree of searching, I would say, a degree of reflection on what that would mean. But as my mind considers the heart of man being an extension of his mind, in some sense primitive, but also agentic and willful in its own right, something that is independent of reason, but often necessarily wed to it. When I imply that I am searching for something, it is possible that I have lost what I'm looking for. I may be searching for something because I long for it. I may be searching for something because I've seen something before, and I know it to be in a particular place or a particular state of mind, and I wish to return there. I guess that's a form of longing. Regardless of the reason, if I say something is unsearchable, I think it implies that either the thing is so hidden that it could not be found, so there's no point in searching for it, or that there's no need to search, in the sense that it is already available. It is already something that is felt and experienced. And I think that we can go in both paths here, both interpretations. It could be a situation in which there is a king. This is lowercase k, a king. While keeping in mind his position and his authority over many people, that his heart exists in a particular place on this continuum, maybe the hierarchy, between the earthly and then up into the heavenly. Verse 2, I think it should be remembered. It is the glory of God to conceal a thing, but the honor of kings is to search out the matter. Now, it is not the case that the glory of God is unsearchable, but it is the case that the heart of kings is unsearchable. So again, I refer back to this position that the king's heart exists at this level. It is a layer that is formed by his own passions, but also it is formed by his responsibility, it is formed by his position. And the degree to which the king, as a unified entity, is responsible or is responsible or capable of feeling responsible, he will also take with him his component parts. He is the aggregate of his social congregation, his kingdom. And this unsearchableness, this implication that there is something within him that is unable to be found, or put differently, unable to be understood, I think at the very least implies a certain vastness of information and of mind and of responsibility, to the point beyond which the normal person probably wouldn't be able to comprehend. Just like the depths of the earth or the heights of heaven, we may be able to see quite a lot within these domains, but with regard to understanding all of it, it is probably unlikely. Now, this makes me think about the modern man. At the very least, the idea of sovereignty for the individual. As a modern man is in a bit of a conundrum as it stands, but we put that aside. The modern man and his heart, his responsibilities, are not necessarily the same as the king, but he shares certain qualities and certain responsibilities that the king must have been burdened by. Making his own way, providing for others. I think where this differs quite a bit is the magnitude, the degree of responsibility that one is tasked with. The direction of a society, the direction of a kingdom, is as existential as it gets. This is much different than a corporation, or even for an individual that participates in a broader collective. Now, if we consider the king and his position relative to a man in a democratic society in the 21st century, it would be like if the communal element of man's democratic participation was unified into one thing, that this loose spirit that occupies the American mind were to be placed within one man. It seems to me that the heart of America is as unsearchable as the heart of a king. I think we can get to some direction of it, but nonetheless, we have to imagine just as much as we can see into heaven and into the earth materially, that the heart is one of the conduits to seeing into both of these places. And because the heart is the conduit of seeing, as far as we can see, seems to be a quality that is unfound at this point. It seems to be relatively unsearchable. That although we know that there are limits of man relative to his creator, or that divine logos, there will likely be no single person that can understand the depths of his experience. Again, it's not to say that there is no boundary around it. And this is, again, illuminated by the fact that there are different human beings that occupy different levels or layers of responsibility, position, the king being the highest, or one of the highest. And given that level, regardless of just the regular individual that has all of the regular existential concerns, the king exists at a level that is on top of all of these different. Again, it's the aggregate of all of them. Take away the dross from the silver, and there shall come forth a vessel for the finer. Take away the wicked from before the king, and his throne shall be established in righteousness. So these are two verses. They are related. They are similar in kind in terms of the way that they started. So there's this rhythm that can be followed between them. So the word dross means something that is generally regarded as worthless. Silver is something that is valuable. So in other terms, I think we can say that take away that which is worthless from that which is valuable, and there shall come forth a vessel for the finer. So here we have another symbol, this vessel, this thing that holds something within it. Now this may be an overinterpretation, I'm not sure, but a vessel is something that can be quite symbolic. Again, it is something that holds something else. But exactly what does this mean? At more of a philosophical level, what does it mean to hold something? In a broader sense, what does it mean? This reminds me of a Platonic dialogue. I think it's Theaetetus, where we discuss what it means to have something, to possess something, to facilitate the passage of information, perhaps. That the vessel is this sort of emissary for which it is, again, transmitting information from one place to another. The information that it may carry may be material information, it doesn't really matter. But again, we have to think in terms of Aristotle for a second here and move our minds away from just the material causes of things and think about things in terms of forms. So if we have a vessel in terms of forms, what lies within that vessel and just generally the function of the vessel, I think, becomes a bit more interesting. Because instead of just transmitting or being on a purposeful or having a purposeful condition such that a form or an idea is held in place, and a vessel is something that is used by man as a sort of a tool to carry, we could think of a book as a vessel, as opposed to some ancient pot that carries water or grain. And in this broader conceptualization of the vessel, we're considering taking away that which is less valuable from the vessel and keeping the elements that are truly valuable, so we have more space, perhaps, that the transmission of information is more efficient. The vessel for the finer. If it is finer, it is something that, again, it is more, it's elegant, it is more purposeful, again, more efficient at achieving the task. So I think in sum, for the first part of this two-part verse that I have read here, is that we are taking out the impurities in our tools that transmit purposeful, meaningful information, whether they be ideas or materials, such that the tool is a more effective and beautiful transmitter, and it causes us to benefit so much the more from it. Now take away the wicked from before the king, and his throne shall be established in righteousness. Now we have a similar pattern here. So I should mention that today is a new day. That last bit of recording was last night. It is now the following day. It is a Tuesday. We are drudging forward in the week. It is always difficult reaching Wednesday and into Thursday, and finally the lively Friday. But nonetheless, we pull forward. We bear our responsibilities. Now, usually what I try to do is leave off on a place where I can easily pick back up again. Stopping in the middle of a reflection or in the middle of a verse is quite difficult because it takes a lot of time to understand where I was at. And also, since these verses are so exploratory and that there are many doors that can be opened by them, sometimes a new day leads to a new reflection and a new interpretation. But nonetheless, to pick up back where I had left off, there is a repeating pattern that is evident here. From verse 4, take away the dross from the silver, and there shall come forth a vessel for the finer. Take away the wicked from before the king, and his throne shall be established in righteousness. So taking away that dross, or the worthless, the rubbish, the material that is poor in value, this symbol is akin to that of the wicked. The symbol of the silver, which is something that is beautiful, it is something that is valuable in a material sense. Now we are transmitting this into our Aristotelian format from material causes now to more of a formal cause, perhaps formal in the sense of form or of mind. And so the silver and its purity and its beauty represents the king. The vessel, that apparatus that transmits the information, or in the last verse, that transmits the material, now transmits and transfers the throne. The throne is the thing that transfers power, or the authority, responsibility. And what is the finer? This purification, the sense of liberation from that unfortunate restraining element, in this case the wicked, in the former case the dross. And so the finer is the paralleled symbol to righteousness. Now I think this deserves a little bit more reflection. That is, this verse 5, take away the wicked from before the king, and his throne shall be established in righteousness. Going along with what I said about this being a formal cause, there's something that strikes me about the beauty of the pattern that is represented here. If it were a song, I would play it over and over and over again. I have a tendency to do this sort of thing. And what's beautiful about it is, in this Aristotelian sense, the move from one form of causality to the other. Now, I don't want to get into the nitpicky details that maybe we shouldn't be separating them, and perhaps there's a place in which these two intersect, and so they're connected in this way. That's fine, but there's obviously a difference in kind when we talk about material objects versus the structure of man's mind and mind in general, referring to the wicked, referring to the position of the king, referring to his throne and to righteousness. So all of those pedantic arguments aside, I would like to focus on the formal causes that are represented in this verse, and one more time to just sort of bask in that, in the reflection of this beautiful pattern that we are seeing here. So let's start with the first part of this verse. Take away the wicked from before the king. Now, in the material sense, it's relatively straightforward. At least it seems like it's straightforward. Removing the impurities of the silver makes it visually more appealing, I would imagine. Perhaps more durable. But when we say that we are taking away the impurities from the king, the impacts of that, I think, are much more difficult to understand, especially the downstream consequences. Moreover, from that, what we are talking about, not just any old impurity, but rather the impurities that are caused by a particular type of cancer, that is, wickedness. Now, wickedness is a fairly broad category. There are some specifics that I think that we can say about it. Now, of the word wicked, I've done this many times, but I think it's a useful exercise. It comes from the term Wicca, which is related to the word witch. Now, the root of this word, Wicca, a wiki, is related to the idea of twisting something or bending something. And there's this connection, I think, to the twisting or bending of mind towards something that is other than correct, other than right. There's a moral aspect to this, at least inferred downstream. But if we take it at its root, what exactly would it mean for a person to bend or to twist something? Well, if they are to bend or to twist their feelings, or bend or twist their reason, we would have to imagine exactly what position our feelings, or the products of our heart, or our reason occupy. So I think that the material causes that has been outlined in the previous verse may be of assistance to us here. When we are thinking about the dross, when we are thinking about the worthless or the impure in the material sense. Now, what is worthless in the material sense is difficult to describe because it requires the mind to determine what is actually the purpose of that material, especially when we're thinking about silver or making something out of silver. Or just generally speaking, if we are thinking about some object, basic material, and there's something within it that maybe visually appears to us to be, or to add impurities, again, this is from a purely visual standpoint, then perhaps if we desire something that is purely silver, it's sort of highly reflective, we would want to get rid of all of the elements that take away from that state that is desired from us. Now, of course, in this realm, it's not really the material causes that we're interested in. But to go back down to this level of the dross and the impurities, I wonder if we can draw a parallel between the impurities causing this type of bending or twisting of what our mind would perceive as some form of unification or of purity, and we can extend this past the visual domain into domains of measurement that are a little bit more precise. And we can think about maybe density, which will tell us some relationship to some volume. And given a particular mass and its relationship to the volume, that may give us an idea of how different masses, or of how masses differ from other masses, or how, maybe I should be a little bit more precise in terms, and to say that that there are materials that differ from other materials based on the relationship of their mass to a particular volume. And so what we see here is a precise way of identification. And in the case of removing the dross from the silver, we are talking about purification. And purification in this sense means moving towards a unity of identity. And so if we are moving towards a unity of identity, whether it be in the material sense or in the sense of removing the wicked from the kingship, then there is something about, now I recognize that there's a thought that I have yet to come back to about this bending and twisting business, but just for the moment, that there is something about the wicked and its participation with the identity of the king that causes it to be impure, that causes the very possibility of forming an accurate identity of the kingship. And it could just be a formal identity in terms of the formal cause of things, that we have an idea of what the kingship, what that position represents. There have been many kings throughout history that have been wicked, and perhaps there have been some that have been righteous. But that's not really the case. The point is, when we are talking in this sphere, just as we are talking about the material, there may be things within the silver or within the iron that are impurities that must be gotten rid of. In the engineering sense, I would imagine that this would take place all of the time, especially when we are considering removing raw material from the earth. There's no way that we would remove pure material from the earth, and it doesn't really make sense to me. It requires a process of refinement, and that process of refining includes the process of precisely identifying substances, materials. And in the same manner, the kingship within the formal domain just like the material has its material domain, will have a type of precision that would allow us to identify its structure, its relationship, just like density will give us some relationship of a material's mass to its volume. There must be some way in which we can measure, observe, whatever, the way in which the impurities of the wicked can infect the kingship. Now, I think getting into the domain of measurement, especially within the realm of formal causes, perhaps I'll approach that later, but I want to get back to this idea of this bending and twisting business, the root of the word Wicca, which is a precursor to the modern word, wicked. So there's obviously something in my mind that doesn't quite yet understand what is being bent and what is being twisted. How are we to conceptualize this? How are we to visualize what is happening here? And as I've mentioned, I believe that there's an aspect of this that is moral, and when we consider the wicked, often what we are considering is something that is of poor moral standing. And I'm tempted to get into how I've been formalizing wickedness thus far, but perhaps that'll come in time. Now, in order to explain where the ground is, where the fundamental, where the root is, where this bending and twisting would have the most impact, I think I have to refer back to what I had mentioned about identity. I believe that it is identity that is this fundamental layer of this formal realm that we are talking about. And this applies both to the identity of the king as we remove the impurities caused by wickedness, or if we are talking about wickedness itself, or just the kingship itself, or king itself, whatever. So we take the wicked. We say that there's an identity of the wicked. We then ask the question, well, how do we understand the relationship of the wicked to other things that would cause it to be independent from other things, so it would have its own identity? And because it has its own identity, we can talk about it. We can identify it. At the fundamental layer, in some senses it's difficult because I think it requires a relationship. The relationship, because it's not a boundary of the wicked into nothingness, it's the boundary of the wicked against something else that causes us to be able to see what it is. So I'll try my best to speak of it without giving an example of a relationship, but then surely I'll probably find myself giving an example of this relationship. So in the first instance, this wickedness of its identity, I have been conceptualizing it as something that can be either understood explicitly or more consequentially acted in the world without really reflecting on the cause or the explicit behavior of one, that they would understand that what they are doing is probably wrong given the broader context of things. So that is, I think wickedness can be a form that the agent may recognize as being a part of itself or not. Now that's something perhaps that can be explored later. I may be incorrect about that, but it just seems to me to be the case that one can be wicked without being self-aware enough to understand that they're wicked, but also one could be self-aware enough to understand that they are wicked and also be wicked. Okay, so we have that. Now, of the structural components that form up the identity, I've considered that wickedness is something of a form of selfishness, that it is quite insular. I think of the internal aspect of mind, and almost like the wall of an ancient city that surrounds the mind. And in the mind of the wicked person, they are likely to keep the gates of the wall closed, that they want what is inside of them, whatever is inside of them, their idea of themselves, to be very homogeneous. They want that society of internal selfhood to be pure of other, perhaps the concept, this is where I get into the possibility of not being self-aware enough to understand that one can be wicked without knowing it. And I think one of the possible ways of this happening is believing that the dross comes from the outside, and that is not something that can just sort of come up within. And I think there's a certain material overlay, in terms of material causes, that makes my mind consider that there's an inside and an outside. And I say inside and outside almost as if I'm thinking materially, like my hand is outside of my head because what's inside of my head is the person. But that's the wrong way to conceptualize it. We're thinking about the formal realm. We're thinking about an agent that exists beyond what we would converse through material causes. Again, even though there are relationships, there are significant relationships, but again, not the pedantism that I'm looking for here. I think a better way to conceptualize this, well, I think there are two ways that we can go here. One is to further complete the thought about the potential way in which a wicked person can be wicked without knowing it, and then to correct for that. So let's begin with the former. Of the dross that one would imagine that is possible, that would come in from the outside, that would pollute the pureness of self, the pureness of one's own identity, this would cause the person then to keep those gates of this ancient city wall closed, or closed enough until they absolutely had to open them and exchange information. But they would limit it, much like a totalitarian regime would limit the open-mindedness of their population. I think of North Korea. I think of the Soviet Union. I think of communist China under Mao. I think of Nazi Germany. I think of fascist Italy, and on it goes. Any society in which this worship of the state apparatus and bureaucratization had occurred, I'm considering this lot. If we condense it down into the individual, that there is this, instead of the state apparatus being the thing that is worshipped as the highest good, or the divine, the supreme divinity that can help solve all our problems, whatever, that can help lead us to the truth, it is the self that is the divine. It is the self that is not necessarily created in the divine image. It is the divine image. And I think it is within this mistake that one can be led into wickedness and not understand it, that they're trying to free themselves from impurities, but what they can't recognize is they can't differentiate what the purities are from the impurities. And so they say that everything outside of the self is impure, and I only interact with the outside world insofar as I need to, because I have to survive. And so I think there's a matter of precision, again, that comes into play here in the formal realm that is necessary to understand how to avoid this. I think one potential answer is to keep the gates open. Now, there has to be some way to understand what the self is. But the self is an agent that acts on information that's in the environment within the formal realm. It is not something that is just an independent thing. It is, what can we say, materially? It is something that it has will. Perhaps you could say it has a boundary around it, but maybe this is not the best way to conceptualize it. It uses the level of these formal causes for its own purposes. It directs these causes towards certain ends. It occupies a certain position. The agent occupies a certain position. That we can have formal causes like, or we can have formal things like wickedness, but wickedness itself is not an agent. Wickedness is a form that the agent uses for some purpose. Now, in terms of the material sense, the material comparison, that the wicked is compared to dross in this way, again, the wicked would be the thing that is the impurity. The impurity is not necessarily the agent. The impurity can occupy the position of the agent, surely. And I think this is sort of what we're getting at here with the king, but we have more to speak of in terms of wickedness. So again, the question is, well, what is being bent here? What is being twisted? Now, so far, I talked about the potential ways in which an agent can be wicked, but again, without understanding the aspect of the agent, or the aspect of the aspect of the agent that is twisted, it's hard to understand exactly what is wicked. And perhaps it is wickedness itself that is this bending and twisting. Now, of course it is. That seems obvious. That is what it means. That is where the roots of the word come from. It is the bending and twisting of the agent, such that it is unable to use the causes in the formal realm towards good purposes. Now, here the matter would have to be decided on. This is where I think the relationship comes into play, because we would have to separate out, much like we separate out the dross from the silver, we would have to identify a good, or something that is beautiful, in order to separate out the twisty and bendy components that don't allow us to appreciate that thing. So in terms of the purposeful realm, there needs to be a decision made, a willful decision. The agent has to do something, has to decide something, has to attend to something, has to act on something. And when it does so, it causes, I think, this cascade of relationships. In order to do something in the world, we decide, we orient our attention towards something, towards some purpose. We attend to it in the way that we would wish to attend to silver, or at least one would hope to do so, because why attend to something if we aren't interested in the thing that we are actually willfully attending to? In the process of doing so, what we are trying to do is to purify, and in that process of purification, there's, I think, if it can't be called a science, then surely it is a discipline. It is a discipline of precisely understanding what purpose we are wishing to fulfill, and then based off of these things, and again, there are different formal things, I think, within the formal realm that we would identify. if we are to be prudent, and if we are to remove the dross from our purposes, then what we would avoid is the bending of our purposes and our attention that is anywhere other than the place it is directed. Now that begs the question, well, we can have some attention or some purpose that is geared towards something that just is not good, is not beautiful. And in that situation, wickedness would be the form that would assist. But I think at the end of that road, I think many people, perhaps maybe I speak for myself when I think about my own temptations, on the inside, when I consider the ways in which I can be wicked, the ways in which the dross perverts my purpose, it comes in the form of a lack of focus. It comes in the form of weakness. It comes in the form of fatigue, perhaps, where the willful part of me is just subdued, servile to the bending and to the twisting. Again, the bending that warps my trajectory towards my ends. Now, everybody, I suppose, has a degree of this. We all have to sleep. Maybe some would consider sleep to be a distracting element, a necessary element. And I think there are many different rabbit holes that we can get down here. But this is part of the process of determining that precise maybe definition of wickedness or how it can manifest. But leaving that as it is, the remainder here, I think it would seem, if there is a remainder, and I'm sure that there is, would be to discuss ways in which we can measure. Like I mentioned density earlier, and this is the relationship of a mass to some volume. So we have different dimensions here. And I think the same type of thinking would apply in this realm, in the purposeful, meaningful realm. Now, exactly how to develop a system that we would do this that's akin to mathematics, that is as precise as mathematics, perhaps there's a way I don't really know. The best way that I know how to do it is to reflect on one's own experiences and to be honest about it. And to be honest about it, I think, involves a process of reflecting on that which is good. And if we are to say that identifying relationships among dimensions is the thing that allows us to more precisely identify something, then I think that within the non-material realm and the formal realm and the realms that transcend us up into the unity, we have to work on identifying our relationship, our dimension, we can say, in this realm, in the realm of mind, to other dimensions of mind. And in so doing, we would separate out different aspects, maybe different purposes, different meanings, different paths. It's hard to say exactly. Just like we would separate out different materials based on differing densities, given their mass and their relationship to a particular volume. And as we have done so, then we will formalize the precision within that realm of causality. Now, I think I'll try to find an example of this, but a reflection on the exploration of how the wicked, or the dross, relates to the wicked, and the silver relates to the position of the kingship, is going to be an important part of this discussion. So, I'll say this explicitly now that I'm going to end this recording here and begin tomorrow. There will be no gap in a few seconds, but just so that it is understood, it will take my mind again some time to build up and to explore this next topic. Okay, so today is a new day. It was a long day, a long work day, but I'm interested to get back into this verse. Now, when I left off that last recording, I sort of wonder if I made a bit of a mistake when I said that an important part of this conversation is the comparison of the dross to the wicked and the silver to the position of the king. Not that that's not true, but I spent a good amount of time talking about the relatedness of the dross and the wicked. Now, perhaps I wanted somewhere else to go, but I'll leave that as it is for now. What I'm interested in doing at this point is considering the wicked's role in the pollution or the parasitization of the position of the king. In order to do that, I think we have to discuss what the position of the king is. And it seems to be suggested here that the position of the king within this map, within the realm of position and of mind, of forms, the position of the king is constant. And I have to wonder about it. I don't necessarily wonder or doubt that the position of the king or the authority of the king is not a constant state. I wonder at its composition. I think that the place can be occupied in many different ways, but the position is certainly related to its authority. But I would not go as far to say that the position is power, or that the authority is power, and power is a component of it, but it is not all that there is. This position is almost of something of a state of nature. It is, as we see in many species, there is the feminine and the masculine. We know that there are certain relationships that just must occur, sexual relationships between the two sexes in order for an offspring to come about. The way in which a relationship can occur is multivariate and sophisticated, surely. And I think that there are plenty of ways in which the relationship can develop given particular contexts. But also there are ways to optimize relationships such that the offspring's survival, the chances for survival increases. And I would not want to reduce this sort of thing or of relationality to this domain. But I would like to highlight, almost as the prior verse highlights the material causes and then bleeds into the formal causes, I think that there is something about relationships and how fundamental they are to the continuing of what we know to be necessary for life or for the organization of human beings. And perhaps there's something more to that as well. Maybe we can say that there is, in the formal realm, much like, again, in the material realm, we identify certain patterns that are consistent with this or that, whatever. In this realm of human collaboration and of organization, the position of the king is a type of position that is embedded within the hierarchy, for which man may discover different ways that he can relate himself to that position, but generally speaking, the position itself is fixed, much like the necessity of two human beings of different sexes coming together to produce the offspring. So, That being said, a sort of a long-winded way to say not all that much, other than this position of the king is important and is probably an embedded position of authority in man's relationship to the formal realm. I have gone on this exploration before, the exercise of asking the question, okay, well, if this thing is to be so fundamental, the position of the king, what is it? Where is it? What does it look like? And to answer that, my mind, in its rather juvenile state, thinks of a throne, thinks of a person that sits atop a throne. Perhaps the person has a scepter, an object that is referred to often in the Bible, a symbol of power and authority. I think of his responsibilities. I think of the symbol that the image represents, that he is responsible for thinking about things that the ordinary person is not responsible for thinking about. And I talked about this a little bit before, especially when considering the individual and the modern notion of the sovereignty of the individual and the rights of man. All of this sort of thing move that position, or move the individual into the position of the king. And again, I think I had mentioned something about democracy and how that position is almost occupies that collective kingship position. At least it deals with those problems at that level. And regardless of, I think, the problems at whatever level, if we move up a level, then I think whatever is atop of the level that we're at will be the manifestation of either a collective or, again, some unified sense into a man or an object, perhaps in our future, an artificial intelligence system. It's hard to say. But this pattern, I think, is generally reliable and consistent. But how can we identify the pattern? I could say that the position of the king perhaps is unique, and maybe I can't draw the relationship between the sovereignty of man and this position at all. I can also make the argument that there is something about the kingship which may possibly be extended to man as he has gained a certain understanding of his inalienable rights, that would possess some formal quality that would make it distinct, that position distinct from other positions, much like, again, that we were talking about with the example of matter and density, that there are fundamental things that allow us to identify what a king is. Now, in a certain sense, I think that there must be a difference between what I had mentioned about the sovereignty of the individual and then the position of the king, because the structural position in which the king occupies is much more paralleled to that of the collective in a free society, and that the governors don't necessarily hold the position of the king. The people, in a certain way, don't hold the unified position of the king, but rather the general state, the general spirit of the society is the thing that rules, rather than a particular individual. And there are elements of the kingship that are distributed to each individual, but in the strict sense, perhaps the individual is not a king. Okay, so I think what we've established here is two forms that seem to be somewhat related. Again, this individual that is responsible for being, for existence, for the big existential questions, in a similar manner that the king would be responsible for the sway of his society, for the way that his people may think, or put in a better way, if he is not a despot, that he is a facilitator. He is the one that wishes to facilitate the flourishing of his mind and of his people's minds. And there's the reciprocal opening type of situation that we see. Now, in terms of the structure, the king is a ruler. He is a leader. He has the sovereignty of his society. He holds it. He is responsible for making those decisions for the people about their welfare, the big decisions. He is at the top of the political hierarchy, perhaps the social and the cultural hierarchy as well. This leads one into considering his responsibilities. Of no little importance, his responsibility is for justice and the ideas that surround what is to be just. Certainly, a king's decision on a particular case would have a large sway throughout society. The populace and their understanding of what is right and what is wrong based on the outcome of a decision. He is responsible for protection and the maintaining of identity of his kingdom. Again, the maintenance of identity requires understanding specific qualities that are unique to that thing. And so there is, as I've mentioned about this reciprocal back and forth, the king possesses many of these qualities. He's the leader of it, but also he must understand something about his people, because his people are all full of spirits and all full of the capacity of mind to consider and to put the creative element and the creative capacity, the generative capacity into the world. And so they are inherently valuable. Again, this is my conception of the value of man, regardless of if a particular society within the political characterization of the kingship, kinghood, whatever, monarchy, maybe we can call it. His responsibility, his protection for identity, is a two-lane street. The better I think that he understands the identity or the qualities that are rightly attributed to those that are in his kingdom relative to the kingdom that butts up against it, the better he is going to be at, I think, effectively ruling. He has, as a part of his responsibilities, military, diplomatic, and all of these are types of things that are communication at a particular level. He communicates for the society. He is the aggregate of all of those souls into one man that spreads and adjudicates on behalf of his people. Now, as I'm thinking about this, I'm thinking about all the different ways in which the king is similar to that of our modern conception of the sovereignty of man. And there are plenty of ways, I think, that this is the case. And there are plenty of ways that this is distributed throughout our society at the most healthy of moments in our history. For I'm not sure that I can say that today is the most healthy that we have been. But given strong institutions and strong cultural identity, I think that there are interesting parallels in which the former kingship into that unified center of mass is within the heart of man, but also the state apparatus occupies a disinterested center for which they can more effectively and impartially adjudicate matters within the collective. There are plenty of ways that I can make parallels here. But I think the remainder, that last little bit for which I cannot draw the parallel between the sovereignty of man, or even the collective spirit of the United States, for example, along with his state apparatus, that all of these things combined don't unify into the same type of individual or center point. I think individual is a good identity, I think is a better word to use. They don't all congregate into the same density of identity. And because of this fact, they are necessarily different, despite them being quite close in a formal sense. Okay, so there is this. Now the question is, getting back to the verse, because I think we've explored to some degree what the position of the king is. What does it mean then for the wicked, as a parasite, to come in and infiltrate that position, the position of the king? And before I get there, actually, I had mentioned when I started today's recording that I think it's likely that within the experience of man and his organization and the way that he sees mind, the way he sees intelligibility, that it always will involve the position of the king at some level, at some point, whether or not we call it a king. We may, in our modern day, believe that the position of the king is nothing but a tyrant, and that it can't necessarily come together in any way that is positive. But it just seems that there is always this congregation and this coalescing into something that then is unified into a single individual. And this can occur at various levels. It hasn't occurred at the level of the entire world. Usually it occurs at smaller levels. And perhaps the types of large kingdoms that we have seen in relatively recent years, in the past few hundred years, is a bit of an anomaly, although kingships have existed for millennia. That these sort of things scale, and ultimately they come into the center point, that one man occupies that position of the king, like Christ, or like a Socratic figure, or Boethius. There are these moments for which we can identify this consolidation of identity and authority. And all of that is to say that in the modern day, from the mind of an American in the year 2024, I think that the way in which this is seen is going to be different. The language that is used will be different. But in any case, to get back to the topic at hand, I'm concerned with how the wicked comes to infiltrate the position of the kingship, the identity of the kingship, and what that would mean downstream. So in order to do that, I have to go back and to reiterate this form of the wicked. Again, this wickedness involves the idea of bending or twisting something, in the sense of bending and twisting within identity. If we have something that is continuous, that has some boundary, if we bend something, twist something, that boundary becomes non-continuous, perhaps. It becomes different. The distinctions that we characterize the identity of something, we can say an object. In front of me I have a bottle of pills that are multivitamins. There are plenty of ways that I can twist and bend the container. Eventually I can twist it enough so that the identity of the container will no longer be recognizable. Or at the very least, it can be recognized, but the purpose is much diminished. And so in a formal sense, the object would increasingly become less effective at fulfilling its role its identity, the true form of what it is supposed to be, that is this container, this vessel with some inscription around the bottle indicating what's actually in the bottle. Now, conceptually, I think it's very important to be able to understand or to see beyond a poor form that's in front of us, and to think about separating the dross from that silver. And the removal of those impurities, again, is the reestablishment of the functional capacity of an object, or of some political position, or of a social, cultural position, or of a philosophy. Anything, I think, could be placed within this realm of identity. Now, with specific regard to the king, since he has so many different responsibilities, and since his position is quite lofty with regard to other men, I find it dazzling, maybe dazzling is not the right word, overwhelming perhaps, that when I think of all of the possibilities for what he is, as an individual, again, that occupies a position with certain responsibilities, how many different doors that the bent and the twisted can enter into his heart, into his soul. And there's such a confluence, such a relationship between the individual human being and the position, and how his spirit, his heart, his reason, his soul is wound up within this place of authority. And since there is so much of this at stake, it would seem that, and perhaps I should stay on one thought, but I have two thoughts going here. It would seem that any little deviation from the form of the righteous king would cause massive reverberations throughout a society, a culture. The way in which an individual thinks about themselves and also about their relationship to other people. The thing that I was thinking about was, before the book of Job, here in the Old Testament, we have a series of books that go through lineage, that go through history, and what is evident to me is that there has been this undulating, this up and down of the righteous king, and then the king that causes the institutions to fail. The people start worshiping idols. Things go astray. They lose the identity. They lose their identity. They lose the identity of the king. Perhaps the king loses his own identity. And it's a tragic thing. It's a terrible thing. But all the same, when it comes back, that the righteousness comes back, the light flows in, it's a beautiful thing. It's a wonderful thing. That process of rediscovery must be intoxicating when it happens. And as I say it, I can't stop myself from thinking about the current predicament that we are in, that we are obviously in, that most of us feel today in 2024 about the state of things, about the state of the nation of the United States, about the state of man's opinion about himself as a sovereign agent, man's opinion about the state and its role in his life, and in the broader position of authority. This type of undulation, this pattern, this wave, seems to be something that we have taken with us since our inception. Perhaps since we have left the Garden of Eden, I could say. So at this moment, I would like to take some of the specific items that I believe likely prop up the identity of the king, and then do a thought experiment of how some sort of twisting and bending, perhaps hollowing out of these principles, the fundamental load-bearing components of the identity of the king, what consequence this might have, both to the person of the king, his position as a political and cultural figure, and also the people that are related to him, that are around him. It could be his subordinates, but also his kingdom and the citizens, or maybe citizens is not a right word, but the populace of his kingdom. So let's start with the first, that of the ruler and of the leader. So in order to really understand what it means to be a ruler and a leader, I think we have to, especially in the context of the king, we have to understand what sovereignty means. So like with many words, I think we have to return to the Latin roots. So from Latin we have the word super and regnum. The word super means above or over something. The word regnum means kingdom or realm. Now the word kingdom really doesn't help us all that much because it has the word king in it. From king we're thinking about the sovereignty of that position. And so going back to king doesn't help us much, but realm maybe a little bit. Now if we put these together, we have super regnum, meaning over the kingdom or over the realm. We could also interpret the word as the prefix, so in terms of the word sovereign, the prefix sov, which comes from that Latin word super, which means above or over, and then reign, the second part, or the root of that word. We have kingdom or rule, which is a little bit different, I think, than what we had just stated. So taking this now to rule from above, we'll keep in the background kingdom and realm. Maybe really quick, it might be worth defining what the word realm means. Now, of course, other than the word kingdom, we have a field or domain of activity or interest, an area, an arena, a region. So it is some place that we could then attribute our different forms to, like our material place, our physical place, the formal place, more of the conceptual-minded place, the essence. We have the agent that is identifying or forming or creating the identity, and then the general purpose or goal of the identity in question, or of the realm. So all of these different things are acting together in this dynamic conceptualization that has, again, grounding at this plane, at this level of reality, of this physical reality that man finds himself in. Okay, so that's realm. Now calling back to attention to rule from above. Now positionally, this is interesting. What does it mean to rule from above? Now the aboveness makes sense. We've already sort of talked about this, that the king is above his subject in the sense that he is responsible for things that the subject is just not responsible for. Now, in a way that we would probably find a bit dated, the king may be responsible for the welfare of that individual, the individual's conception or movement of self is not as open as we consider it to be now. And again, I recall my previous thoughts on the state of the United States and how this is again changing. But nonetheless, another part of this aboveness. And again, it's aboveness in terms of responsibilities. And since we were talking about being a ruler and a leader, what we have so far put into that category is the welfare of the people. We could put control of the people. We could spin this in the contrarian, or we can spin this in the positive or the negative. Contrarian, I'll get rid of that word. So we could spin this in the positive or the negative. The ruler can be a tyrant or a righteous ruler. The king can be seen as the embodiment of law and order, that what is considered right and what is considered wrong on this large-scale dynamic thing that is a society that exists within this realm is decided by one person, by the king. Now, I think I mentioned earlier that this is probably not truly possible, that there is going to be some affordances given, but generally speaking, the king has the authority to make decisions on matters that are of significant importance. Surely he will be influenced, and if he's a righteous king, he will take his influence well and consider it and reflect on it, with the first principle being that he is not the sovereign ruler of all, but rather just among his subjects. We can add the word prosperity to the responsibility of a king. This sort of goes along with the word welfare of the subjects. There's a military aspect here, which I think we can probably attribute this to, again, welfare. Military pursuits are often in terms of protection or expansion. If a king, a realm is looking to expand their cultural influence or the physical boundaries of their realm, it's often done so out of the wish to have more, to be more prosperous, to have more territory, to have more wealth. It is generally not the case, I think, that a king embarks on a military affair so that his kingdom would be destroyed. I suppose it's possible, but there's really not much use, I think, in considering these types of situations. He would be betraying his responsibility. I suppose that's one way in which we can identify a bend in the institution, because the king is not adequately providing. I think the bend would just as we talked about the possibility that the self can be deceived such that it would bring about this state of wickedness, but also it can be a conscious decision to bend and to twist things according to their own desires. And so they have this willful wickedness. In the same manner, I think a king can embark on let's say, just for example, a military expedition, and the military expedition can be a complete failure, but not necessarily in a willful sense. The king obviously wanted to do something with this affair, to either protect his citizens or again to expand his empire or his kingdom. And his failure will bring upon this bending and twisting of his position because he failed in his responsibility. On the flip side, there may be a situation in which there is so much corruption that the king is so interested about his own affairs that he ignores, again, the other roles and responsibilities that he is in that position in the first place to fulfill and to satisfy. In that sense, there's more of a willful bending and twisting, in which that would be a wicked dross that must be removed from that position because it's an impurity. It's a failure of identity. So today is a new day. It is a Friday. And I am sitting here wondering what else I should explore, given what we've talked about already in this verse. I think I've spent a considerable amount of time in verse 4 and verse 5. Now, thus far, I have been discussing wickedness as it perverts the position of the king, and how that flows downstream to affect the society, the mind of the person that is involved with a particular kingdom or within a particular realm. I think there's more to be said about the position of the king, and again, those fundamental structural components or principles by which we identify the principality of the king. So far, I have mentioned his judicial function, his function as a military leader, a leader in general, an individual that is responsible for other people, for the welfare of his kingdom and of the people that are in it. Now, the question that is currently floating in my mind, well, there are a few questions that are currently floating around in my head. One is, what does it necessarily mean when we have changed the position of the king in the modern day, and we have distributed the powers that were vested within? And of course, throughout history, I think the king, as he was considered to be, held all sorts of various levels of that position. And within it, the question can be asked, well, because this has happened, and because any given king in society may exist at any given level of authority, that is, a king may have absolute authority, he may delegate many of his responsibilities to the nobles that are under him, he may be more of a symbolic or ceremonial figure, like in the case of the United Kingdom. I think about the change, the pattern of history for which positions, institutions, political classes, types of societal organizations have risen and have fallen. We have identified different ways in which a strong leader or a weak leader has led to the change of a society. And over time, as maybe the strong leader or the weak leader has aged, our organization, the principles by which we govern ourselves, are molded and shifted to bear the weight of the burdens of our sins, perhaps. And I wonder at this constancy of the centralization of authority. I wonder, despite moving of sovereignty into different realms or different positions, perhaps I should say, within the formal sphere, I wonder at its resting place, this position of the king. Much like gravity directs water, I have to imagine that within the realm of the domain of power, but not limited to power, within the domain of what is right, what is sensible, there are times for which this centralization will occur. And I think it's easy to get lost in the variability of it all. What level that the centralization can take place in, what the various components of that centralization are, And if it is required for one man to hold it all, for the conditions to be right for this expression of the king to take place, I think it can be said that the righteous king that holds the type of authority that has been mentioned here is unique and uncommon. Just like the centralization of authority in the divine sense into the form of God is unique and uncommon. Common in certain ways, surely, but uncommon in the existence of that being in relationship to all of the other beings or potential beings. So one must wonder, then, what is it that causes this centralization to take place? And now the word centralization, I think, is insufficient. It's sufficient enough to describe the moving away from a certain state of randomness to a more precise state, a state of greater intelligibility or identification or identity. And so it would seem that my mind wishes to say centralization because there is something about the center, something about the moving towards some point of attention that is of concern. Now again, as I mentioned earlier, it's easy to get lost. I quickly get lost in what all of it means. I get lost in the sense that my mind wishes to think about the modern state apparatus and how many of them had fallen in the 20th century into fascism or communism, whatever, into the various figureheads that we had seen during the Second World War. We wouldn't necessarily call them kings, but they are approaching, I think, this type of status. Now, surely many of these individuals would not be considered as righteous, perhaps, though some may be. We have this nominalist aspect that during the war we had such centralization of power, and after it, in order to fight a battle, a war that was on an existential level, it was something that was more than the more superficial and basic aspects of our capacity. It was more on the higher register. It was global. And I say that because the stakes and the amount of information, the kinetic information that was being exchanged, was very great. It needed to be great. Many things were changing. It was chaotic. And among the chaos that permeates the collective, I think there comes a time where the opportunity presents itself where the leader or the king steps in, however we may call this leader. Of democratic societies, in England I think of Winston Churchill. Of the United States I think of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the only president to serve more than 2 terms, a president who, even before the war, had such a profound impact on moving or taking power or sovereignty away from people. I don't mean to say that power and sovereignty are equivalent here, but rather taking away that place of authority and giving it to the state apparatus and to an extension to himself in order to combat what was seen as a chaotic environment of the Great Depression. His third, obviously, being centered on combating the war. One of his large, lasting impacts was the New Deal, which was specifically put into effect because of the Great Depression. It provided relief for the unemployed and for the poor, provided for the recovery of the economic situation back to normal levels, and it reformed the financial system to prevent a repeat depression. Now, all of these things, whether we believe them to be necessary or not, I think caused quite a shift to quell the chaotic environment. And this shift came with a sacrifice. The sacrifice at the time probably was accepted by many because of their state of wanting. But what they gave up was elements of what they are given by God, their capacities. Their efforts were, and their attention was, and currently is, devoted towards feeding this state apparatus. And of course, there's a relationship that the state apparatus also feeds the individuals that depend on it in terms of Social Security, which was one of the acts that was put into place at this time. Now, I don't necessarily mean to say that any of this is good or bad. I have my opinions on it, but it would seem that in terms of the American soul, this was an unfortunate series of events. But with relation to this verse, with relation to the position of the king, I can better appreciate what the role of the king is in exigent circumstances. And as much as I can see the consolidation of authority within one person given certain circumstances, whether it be in the case that I had mentioned during the Second World War, or in cases of a different type of societal organization in terms of a kingship. And I can also see how this position can be occupied by the collective, that it is something that is shared among each individual, and that the chaos that is prevented by the king's rule and authority is held together by rational bodies, by disinterested bodies that weigh the evidence, that look to appeal to the heights of our reason to come to the truth, at least in matters of adjudication and legislation. At least we would hope so. But this position, it would seem, under many different circumstances, is open, is porous to its changing state, changing condition. And I think the beauty of this is when it happens in a pure sense. Now, of purity and of man's relationship to it, I think is an interesting one. Let's take an example of the spoon. A silver spoon may be filled with all sorts of different impurities. The dross can be within it. I think at certain levels that we can participate, we can accept the identity of polluted silver, as long as it fulfills a basic purpose a purpose that is required given the context that we find ourselves in. Perhaps this state may represent something that is temporary. It is moving, it is liminal, it is moving from one phase to the next. And as we move into that phase, we begin to discover what the impurities are. And we begin to remove them as we see fit. And in our days of purity, wherever the place of authority may rest, if it is to be right, if it is to be true, then we accept it, regardless of if it's a highly centralized form of organization or not. I think there are many of interesting things that can be said about where this rightful place of authority, or how this rightful place of authority ought to be occupied. But that is not necessarily my goal here. Nor is it to expound the virtues of individual sovereignty as an American in 2024. Perhaps at a later time. Take away the wicked from before the king, and his throne shall be established in righteousness. So again, it is because of the removals of the impurities and the formalization of identity that causes it to be true that there is no bent nature, there is no twisted nature, such that the people flourish, they prosper. Now, of course, a king is an imperfect being. He is a man. He is not God. But he may be wise to his credit, and he may be judicious to his credit, and he may do well by his people to his credit. And insofar as he is able to do such things, given the state of existence that he is given, he may be righteous, assuming that the most fundamental qualities of his authority stay well within that identity, and he retains that power. So I think I'm going to end this episode here, and I'm going to continue next time with verse 6.